You wake, and the first thought that crosses your mind is not of duty, not of the Emperor's glory, not of the ship's chronometer marking another day in the endless void. The first thought is silence, the absence of something you cannot name, something that should be there but isn't. Like a missing tooth your tongue keeps finding. My name is Lucian Vea. I was a lieutenant commander aboard the Imperial Navy vessel Righteous Indignation, a dictator-class cruiser that had served the Emperor faithfully for 3 centuries before I ever set foot on her decks. For 12 years, I executed my duties with the precision expected of an officer trained on Bacca, where they teach you that hesitation is heresy and efficiency is prayer. I knew the weight of every decision, the cost of every maneuver, the sacred responsibility of shepherding 40,000 souls through the warp's malevolent currents. But somewhere in those 12 years, between the 100th compliance action and the 1000th inspection of plasma conduits, something began to hollow out inside me. It started small, this emptiness, a moment during morning prayers when the words felt like ash on my tongue, a pause before giving an order, not from uncertainty but from a strange distance, as if I were watching someone else live my life. The void between stars has a way of changing a person, not the dramatic transformation you read about in cautionary tales, where corruption announces itself with horns and mutations. This was quieter, more insidious, like erosion wearing away at stone, so gradual you don't notice until the foundation gives way. I remember the day it truly began. We had just concluded a successful boarding action against an Orc raider, a textbook operation that resulted in minimal casualties and maximum glory for the Emperor. The crew was jubilant, their voices echoing through the corridors as they cleaned weapons and shared stories of the battle. I should have felt pride, satisfaction, the warm glow of duty fulfilled. Instead, I felt nothing. Standing in my quarters that night, staring out at the starfield through the armored viewport, I pressed my palm against the cold metal of the bulkhead. The sensation was sharp, immediate, real in a way that nothing else had been for months. I pressed harder until the ridged edges of the hull plating bit into my skin, and for the first time in weeks, I felt truly alive. That night, I dreamed of whispers. They came not as words, but as sensations, caressing the edges of my consciousness like silk against bare skin. In the dream, I stood in a vast chamber filled with impossible geometries, where every surface sang with a different note, and the air itself tasted of honey and copper. A voice, melodious and terrible, spoke my name with such perfect pronunciation that it seemed to resonate in my bones. "Lucian," it said, and the sound was like coming home to a place you never knew existed. You hunger, don't you? You thirst for something beyond the grey monotony of duty. I can show you sensations that would make a saint weep with joy. I woke with a gasp, my heart hammering against my ribs. The dream clung to me like perfume, sweet and cloying, impossible to wash away. I told myself it was nothing, a byproduct of stress and too many years in the void. But as I went through my morning routine, shaving with the same razor I had used for a decade, I found myself drawing the blade across my skin with just a fraction more pressure than necessary. The tiny sting of pain was exquisite. The changes began slowly. I started taking longer routes through the ship, seeking out sections where the hull sang with different harmonics as the vessel cut through space, the engineering decks where the plasma reactors hummed with barely contained fury, the observation galleries where the void silence pressed against the viewport like a living thing. Each location offered its own subtle symphony, and I found myself cataloguing these sensations with the same meticulous attention I had once reserved for tactical assessments. My subordinates began to notice, not the change itself, which was too gradual and too subtle for their coarse perceptions, but the effects. I spoke with greater care, choosing words that seemed to carry more weight, more meaning. When I gave orders, there was a new quality to my voice, a resonance that made crew members listen with an attention bordering on fascination. I discovered that by modulating my tone just so, I could make a reprimand feel like a caress, or turn a simple commendation into something that made the recipient's eyes shine with an almost religious fervour. The first time I truly understood what was happening to me, I was in the ship's chapel during evening prayers. Chaplain Moricus was leading the congregation through the litany of duty, his voice booming off the vaulted ceiling. But beneath his words I heard something else, a counterpoint melody, sweet and seductive, that turned the familiar prayers into something almost sensual. The incense, which had always smelled of sanctity and tradition, now carried undertones of exotic spices and forbidden delights. I looked around at my fellow officers, their faces set in expressions of proper reverence, and realized that I alone could hear the hidden music, smell the phantom fragrances. The knowledge should have terrified me. Instead, I felt a thrill of anticipation so intense it made my hands tremble. That night, I made my first conscious choice to embrace the change. I returned to my quarters, and with the methodical precision of a man conducting an experiment, I began to explore the boundaries of sensation. I started with simple things. The texture of my uniform fabric against skin made hypersensitive by anticipation. The play of light from the room's lumens casting shadows that seemed to dance with deliberate intent. The taste of recaf transformed from the bitter stimulant I had consumed mechanically for years into a complex symphony of flavors that bloomed across my tongue like exotic flowers. Within days, I'd progressed to more elaborate explorations. I discovered that pain, applied with the proper technique and timing, could transcend mere discomfort to become something approaching ecstasy. A stylus pressed into the palm until it drew blood. The sharp edge of a data slate scraped across the inside of my wrist. Each sensation was a revelation, a crack in the grey monotony of existence that let in light from a more vivid world. But it was not enough. It was never enough. The whispers came more frequently now, no longer confined to dreams but seeping into my waking hours. They spoke of pleasures beyond physical sensation, of experiences that could remake the very structure of reality itself. They told me of others who had walked this path before me, mortals who had transcended the limitations of flesh and duty to become something magnificent and terrible. The voices were patient, never demanding, always offering. They understood that true corruption, the kind that lasts, must come from within. My work began to suffer, though not in ways my superiors could easily identify. I still completed my duties with apparent competence, but the quality of my attention had changed. Where once I had focused on efficiency and results, I now found myself drawn to the aesthetic elements of command, the elegant curve of a maneuver that brought our weapons to bear at precisely the right moment, the symphony of destruction as our broadside reduced an enemy vessel to glowing debris, the way terror and respect mingled in a subordinate's eyes when I delivered particularly creative punishment for incompetence. I began to take a more active role in discipline aboard the ship. The righteous indignation had always maintained strict standards, but under my growing influence, punishments became more elaborate, more artistic. A rating court sleeping on duty found himself confined to a chamber where I'd arranged mirrors and lights to create patterns that induced euphoric exhaustion, his punishment becoming a kind of rapturous torment he would later beg to experience again. A petty officer who showed disrespect was made to polish the same section of corridor for 18 hours straight. But I showed her how to find ecstasy in the repetitive motion until the work became a meditation that left her weeping with gratitude for the privilege. The crew noticed these changes, but their response was not what I had expected. Instead of fear or disgust, they showed an increasing fascination with my methods. When I spoke, they leaned forward, hanging on every word. When I walked the corridors, conversation stopped, not from respect, but from a kind of hungry anticipation. They began to compete for my attention, vying to see who could earn my approval, my touch, my notice. I realized that whatever was changing in me was beginning to affect others. My presence had become a kind of drug, intoxicating and addictive. The knowledge filled me with a dark joy that I could barely contain. The breakthrough came during a routine inspection of the ship's Vox array. I was alone in the communication chamber, surrounded by banks of equipment that hummed with barely audible frequencies. As I ran the standard diagnostic procedures, I began to notice that the static between channels contained patterns, structures that resembled music more than random noise. I adjusted the equipment, fine-tuning the receivers to isolate these phantom signals. What I heard changed everything. It was a symphony of sensation, a composition that existed in the spaces between reality and dream. Every note seemed to resonate not just in my ears, but throughout my entire body, awakening nerve endings I had never known existed. The music spoke of possibilities beyond mortal comprehension, of pleasures that could drive a person mad with their intensity, of a realm where every desire could be fulfilled and exceeded. I listened for hours, my body rigid with concentration, my mind expanding to accommodate new concepts of beauty and horror. When I finally shut down the equipment, the ordinary world seemed grey and lifeless by comparison. Colours looked washed out, sounds fell flat, even the air itself felt thin and unsatisfying. That was the night I first heard her voice clearly, not as a whisper or suggestion, but as a direct communication from something vast and terrible and beautiful beyond human understanding. "My dear Lucienne," she said, and her voice was like honey poured over broken glass, sweet and dangerous. "You have progressed so far, so quickly, but this is only the beginning. There are depths of experience waiting for you that would make your current revelations seem like the fumbling of a child. All I ask is that you trust me. Let me guide you to sensations beyond the limitations of mortal flesh." I should have resisted. Every piece of training I had received, every oath I had sworn, every prayer I had memorized screamed at me to reject this voice, to call for the chaplain, to submit myself for purification. Instead, I knelt in the darkness of the vox chamber and whispered my acceptance. The transformation accelerated from that moment. My senses sharpened to supernatural levels, allowing me to perceive layers of reality that had been invisible before. I could taste emotions in the air around me, see the flow of desire and fear through the ship's corridors like visible currents. The crew's fascination with me deepened into something approaching worship. Though they remained unaware of the change in themselves, I began to experiment with this newfound influence, learning to shape the emotional atmosphere around me like a sculptor working clay. A word here, a gesture there, the precise application of eye contact or touch, and I could transform anger into adoration, fear into fascination, duty into desperate need. The ship's discipline remained intact, but it had taken on a new character. Orders were followed not from obligation, but from a kind of ecstatic devotion. The first time I killed for pleasure, it was during a boarding action against a heretic raider. We had breached their hull and were fighting room to room through their vessel's twisting corridors. I cornered one of their warriors in a storage compartment, a scarred woman with madness in her eyes and obscene symbols carved into her flesh. She should have died quickly, efficiently, according to the Tactica Imperialis. Instead, I found myself studying the precise architecture of her fear, the way terror resculpted her features into something almost artistic. I prolonged her death across 17 minutes, each cut calculated to provide maximum sensation while extending the experience. The sounds she made transformed from screams into something resembling music, and in her final moments, I saw understanding dawn in her eyes as she experienced the same transcendence through agony that I had found through pleasure. Her gratitude, whispered with her last breath, was more intoxicating than any drug. When my squad found me standing over her body, they saw only another dead heretic and their commander victorious in single combat. They could not see the way reality had shifted around me during those perfect moments, the way the boundaries between self and universe had dissolved into something greater. I began to seek out such opportunities with growing desperation, the memory of that perfect experience haunting every mundane moment that followed. Normal sensation had become insufficient, requiring ever greater extremes to achieve the same heights of transcendence. I volunteered for boarding actions, personal combat missions, any situation that might provide new territories of experience to explore. But each kill taught me diminishing returns. What had once sent me into raptures now felt merely pleasant. I needed more, always more, an endless escalation that promised fulfillment but delivered only deeper hunger. My quarters became a laboratory for these explorations, but also a shrine to my own transformation. I arranged mirrors to capture my changing features from every angle, mesmerized by the subtle perfection creeping into my bone structure. I collected artifacts from our victories, each one chosen not just for beauty, but for its ability to provide new forms of stimulation, a ceremonial blade that sang different notes based on how deeply it cut flesh, a silk banner that felt like liquid fire against bare skin and left patterns of sensation that lasted for hours. Every surface in my quarters reflected back images of increasing beauty, feeding a vanity that grew more consuming with each glance. The dreams came nightly now, vivid beyond any normal sleep vision. I walked through palaces of impossible architecture, where every surface was warm to the touch and the very air pulsed with sensual energy. I attended concerts where the music was so beautiful it could kill the unprepared, where notes hung in the air like physical objects that could be grasped and consumed. I dined on foods that exploded with flavors no mortal tongue was meant to experience, each bite a small death and rebirth. In these dreams, she came to me more frequently, no longer content to remain a voice, but manifesting in forms that changed with each encounter. Sometimes she appeared as a woman of supernatural beauty, her skin pale as starlight, her eyes holding depth that contained entire universes. Other times, she was something more abstract, a pattern of sensation and desire that existed beyond physical form but could touch the mind directly. "You understand now," she told me during one particularly vivid encounter. "The Emperor promises you salvation through suffering, through the denial of self, through the grey monotony of duty. But what has that brought you? What joy have you found in his service? I offer something infinitely more valuable, the complete realization of every potential within you. Pain and pleasure, creation and destruction, all boundaries dissolved in perfect experience. I wanted to argue, to defend the oaths I had sworn and the life I had lived, but the words would not come. How could I deny the truth of what she offered when I had tasted even the smallest portion of it, and found it more nourishing than decades of faith? The corruption was no longer limited to dreams and private moments. It began to manifest in my daily interactions, subtle at first, but growing bolder as my confidence increased. During briefings, I would speak with a cadence that made tactical discussion sound like poetry, my voice weaving patterns that made strategic decisions feel inevitable rather than chosen. Officers found themselves agreeing with proposals they would normally question, their rational objections dissolving in the face of my inexplicably compelling arguments. I discovered that I could induce minor hallucinations in others with nothing more than the proper combination of words and gestures. A rating would see flowers blooming in the corridors, beautiful, impossible growths that existed only in his perception but felt more real than the metal bulkheads around him. A tech priest would hear musical harmonies in the machine spirit's hymns, driving her to new heights of devotional fervor as she sought to recreate these phantom melodies in her work. These manifestations were always subtle, always deniable. Anyone experiencing them could dismiss the visions as fatigue, stress, the natural consequence of too much time in the void. But I knew the truth. Reality was beginning to bend around my presence, responding to my will in ways that grew stronger with each passing day. The ship itself seemed to change under my influence. Corridors that had been sterile and functional took on new characteristics, their shadows deeper and more inviting, their acoustics somehow more pleasing to the ear. The chapel's incense began to carry new fragrances that made worship feel less like duty and more like celebration. Even the food synthesizers produced meals with flavors more complex and satisfying than their programming should have allowed. My fellow officers began to compete for my attention in ways they could not quite articulate. They would linger after briefings, hoping I might speak to them privately. They started adopting small changes in their appearance and behavior, unconsciously mimicking aspects of my own transformed presence. Lieutenant Saxis began wearing her hair in a style that framed her face more attractively. Commander Thaddeus started choosing words with greater care, seeking the kind of verbal elegance he had observed in my speech. They were being corrupted by proximity to me, though none of them understood what was happening. The realization filled me with a mixture of guilt and exhilaration. Guilt because I was betraying every principle of loyalty and duty I'd once held sacred, and exhilaration because the power to reshape reality itself was intoxicating beyond any pleasure I had previously imagined. The point of no return came during our encounter with the Chaos cult that had taken root on Hive World Malthus. We had been tasked with providing orbital support for the Imperial Guard forces conducting purification operations on the planet's surface. It should have been a routine action, the kind of compliance mission I had executed dozens of times before. But as we took position in the planet's orbit, I felt something calling to me from the surface. Not a voice this time, but a resonance, a harmonic frequency that seemed to match something deep within my altered soul. Against all protocols, I requested permission to lead a reconnaissance mission to investigate reports of cult activity in the Hive's upper spires. Captain Alexandros granted my request, though I could see confusion in his eyes. The mission was well within the capabilities of our junior officers, hardly requiring the personal attention of a lieutenant commander. But my words carried weight beyond their mere meaning now, and his objections dissolved before he could fully form them. I took a small team of hand-picked soldiers, men and women who had shown the greatest susceptibility to my influence over the preceding months. We descended to the planet's surface in a Valkyrie gunship, passing through layers of toxic atmosphere that turned the sky the color of old blood. The hive city of Malthus Prime was a monument to industrial decay, its towering spires reaching toward the poisoned sky like the fingers of a drowning giant. Our target was Spire Luxuria, one of the hive's noble quarters that had reportedly fallen to cult influence. As we approached the structure, I could feel the presence I had sensed from orbit growing stronger, pulling at something in my chest like a physical tether. We breached the spire's defenses and began our ascent through levels of increasingly bizarre architecture. The cult had been busy transforming what had once been noble residences into something that resembled the palaces from my dreams. Walls had been carved with flowing organic patterns that seemed to move when viewed peripherally. The air was heavy with incense that carried overtones of desire and madness. My squad moved through these transformed spaces with growing unease, but they followed my orders without question. Their loyalty to me had transcended mere military discipline, becoming something deeper and more personal. They would have walked into hell itself if I had commanded it, and perhaps that was exactly what I was asking them to do. We found the cult's inner sanctum in what had once been a ballroom. The space had been transformed into a temple dedicated to sensory excess, its walls lined with mirrors that reflected not your image but your most secret desires. The floor was covered in cushions and silks of colours that should not exist, fabrics that seemed to glow with inner light. At the centre of it all stood an altar carved from a single piece of obsidian, its surface polished to mirror brightness. The cultists were waiting for us, but not as enemies. They knelt in positions of worship, their faces turned toward me with expressions of desperate hunger. Their leader, a woman whose beauty had been enhanced beyond human norms, approached with hands extended in welcome. "We have been expecting you, Lucien Villa," she said, and her voice carried harmonics that made my altered senses sing with recognition. "She has been preparing us for your arrival. We are ready to serve, ready to learn, ready to transcend the limitations of mortal flesh." I should have ordered my squad to open fire. These were heretics, enemies of the Emperor, traitors to humanity itself. Every aspect of my training demanded their immediate execution. Instead, I found myself walking toward the altar, drawn by forces that had grown too strong to resist. The obsidian surface was covered with symbols that seemed to shift and change as I watched them. Geometric patterns that hurt to look at directly, but conveyed meaning beyond language. I placed my hand upon the stone and felt a jolt of connection, as if I were completing a circuit that had been waiting for my touch for millennia. The transformation was instantaneous and total. Every barrier I had maintained between my public duty and my private explorations crumbled in an instant. The whispers that had haunted my dreams for months became a roar of ecstatic communication, and I finally understood the true nature of the voice that had been guiding my corruption. She was not merely a demon or a fragment of chaos energy. She was sensation itself, the living embodiment of every possible experience, the goddess of pleasure and pain and the infinite territories that lay between them. Slaanesh, the Dark Prince, the perfect one, whose domain encompassed all the ways that consciousness could be extended beyond its normal limits. In that moment of contact, she showed me visions that rendered my previous experiences as pale shadows. I saw worlds where pain and pleasure had merged into a single sublime experience, where mortals had transcended the boundaries of individual existence to become part of something larger and more beautiful than anything the Emperor's realm could offer. I witnessed the birth of new sensations that had no names in human language, emotions so complex they could drive the unprepared mad with their intensity. My beloved Lucienne, her voice resonated through every fibre of my being, no longer external but part of my own thoughts. "Look how beautiful you have become. See how perfectly you have shaped yourself into something worthy of my attention. Your reflection shows what mortals could achieve if they abandoned their pathetic limitations. This is only the beginning of the perfection I can help you attain. Each act of transcendence makes you more magnificent, more deserving of the gifts I bestow." I turned to face my squad, and in their eyes I saw not just the reflection of my own transformation, but recognition of something superior, something they desperately wanted to possess for themselves. My features had taken on a perfection that hurt to look at directly, my skin luminous with an inner radiance that made me appear as something more than mortal. When I spoke, my voice carried undertones that bypassed rational thought and ignited primal desires they had never dared acknowledge. "My friends," I said, and the words seemed to hang in the air like visible things, beautiful and terrible. "We have found something beyond duty, beyond the Emperor's cold promises. We have found truth." One by one they knelt before me, their faces showing the same desperate hunger I had seen in the cultists. The corruption was spreading, passing from me to them like a contagious ecstasy that transformed everything it touched. I could see the change happening in real time as their features sharpened. Their movements became more graceful, and their eyes gained depths that held promises of experiences beyond imagination. The cultists began to sing, their voices weaving harmonies that made the air itself seem to vibrate with anticipation. The temple's mirrors reflected not our physical forms, but our souls in the process of transformation, showing us as we were becoming rather than what we had been. In those reflections I saw creatures of impossible beauty, beings that had transcended the limitations of human existence to become something glorious and damned. I spent 3 days in that temple, learning from the cultists who had preceded me on this path. They taught me techniques for extending sensation beyond the normal limits of flesh, ways to perceive reality through multiple layers of consciousness simultaneously, and methods for sharing experience directly from mind to mind without the crude intermediary of language. Each lesson was a revelation that reshaped my understanding of what existence could be, but also created new hungers that demanded satisfaction. I learned to taste colours, but ordinary hues became flat and lifeless, requiring ever more vibrant and impossible shades to achieve the same effect. I discovered how to see music as visible geometric forms, but simple melodies began to sound like crude noise, forcing me to seek increasingly complex harmonies that bordered on painful intensity. The cultists taught me to share experience directly from mind to mind, but the intimacy was so overwhelming that normal human contact felt like touching shadows. When we finally returned to the righteous indignation, we brought the corruption with us like a virus that spread through contact and proximity. I no longer made any effort to hide the changes in myself. My quarters were transformed into a shrine to sensory excess, filled with artifacts and artworks that spoke to the deeper truths I had discovered. My uniforms were altered with subtle touches that enhanced their aesthetic appeal while remaining technically within regulations. The crew's response was immediate and overwhelming. Where once they had shown mere fascination with my presence, they now displayed open devotion that bordered on worship. Officers competed to serve under my command. Ratings volunteered for extra duties, if it meant spending more time in my vicinity, and even the ship's tech priests began to incorporate aesthetic considerations into their maintenance routines, seeking to make the vessel's mechanical functions more pleasing to the senses. Captain Alexandros was the last to succumb, his years of experience and strong faith making him resistant to the subtle influence I exerted. But even he was not immune to the changes spreading through his ship. I watched him struggle with growing confusion as his crew showed increasing devotion to me, their efficiency and morale reaching unprecedented heights, while their adherence to standard imperial doctrine became more flexible. The final conversion came during a confrontation in his ready room, where he had summoned me to discuss reports of irregularities in my conduct and the behavior of those under my influence. He sat behind his desk, trying to project the authority of decades of command, but I could see the uncertainty in his eyes. "Lucian," he said, and his voice carried less conviction than he intended. "I've been receiving concerning reports about changes aboard this vessel. Crew members speaking of visions, of experiences that seem to go beyond normal human perception. There are whispers that you may be involved somehow." I sat across from him, allowing a small smile to play across my features. The simple expression caused him to lean forward, unconsciously, drawn by an attraction he could not understand or resist. "Captain," I replied, my voice modulated to carry precisely the right balance of respect and intimacy. "Have our mission performance ratings declined? Has discipline broken down? Are the crew anything less than completely devoted to their duties?" He frowned, consulting the data slate in front of him. No, quite the opposite. Performance has been exceptional across all departments, but exceptional in ways that seem unnatural, as if the crew has found new sources of motivation beyond simple duty to the Emperor. Is that not to be celebrated? I leaned back in my chair, the movement causing the light to catch the subtle modifications I had made to my uniform's decoration. Surely the Emperor is pleased when his servants find joy in their service, when they exceed all expectations through sheer dedication. The captain's eyes were drawn to those decorative elements following the flowing patterns I had incorporated into the standard Imperial Aquila. As he stared, I could see his breathing deepen, his pupils dilate with the first stirrings of the same hunger that had claimed the rest of the crew. Yes, of course. The Emperor desires devoted service from his children, he said, but his voice had lost its earlier authority. It's just that some of the ratings speak of seeing impossible beauty in the ship's corridors, of hearing music in the machine spirit's hymns. These sound like symptoms of what, Captain? I let my voice drop to a whisper that somehow carried more clearly than his previous shouting. Of a crew that has discovered the true glory of service, of soldiers who fight with passion rather than mere obligation, of servants who see the divine presence in all things rather than just during formal prayers. Each word I spoke seemed to resonate in the air between us, and I could see his resistance crumbling like walls built of sand. His hand moved unconsciously toward his throat, fingers tracing the collar of his uniform as if it had suddenly become restrictive. "The things they describe," he said, and now his voice carried a note of desperate curiosity rather than authoritative concern. "The visions, the sensations they claim to experience. Is it possible that they're actually perceiving something real? Something that the rest of us are too limited to see?" I stood and walked around his desk, moving with the fluid grace that had become natural to me. As I approached, I could see him struggling with the urge to flee and an equally powerful desire to remain in my presence. "Captain Alexandros," I said, placing my hand gently on his shoulder. The contact sent visible shivers through his entire body. "What if I told you that everything they describe is true? That there are levels of reality beyond the crude materialism taught by the Mechanicus, dimensions of experience that make our current existence seem like a grey shadow of what life could be?" His eyes widened, and I could see the exact moment when his rational mind gave way to the deeper hunger that exists in every human soul. The transformation was visible, his features sharpening, his movements becoming more graceful, his voice taking on new harmonics when he spoke. "Show me," he whispered. And in those two words, I heard the same desperate need that had driven my own corruption months before. The ship's conversion accelerated from that point, but it was not merely change, it was competition. With the captain openly under my influence, crew members began vying to demonstrate their own transcendence, each trying to outdo the others in displays of enhanced perception and aesthetic achievement. Rituals of worship were modified to incorporate elements that pushed the boundaries of sensation further each time, creating an escalating cycle where yesterday's revelation became today's baseline requirement. The vessel's routines transformed into ceremonies of ever-increasing complexity, where the arrangement of weapons became choreographed art and combat preparations required levels of perfection that drove participants to ecstatic exhaustion. We began to attract attention from other Imperial vessels, their communications growing increasingly urgent as they observed our irregular behavior patterns. Our responses to standard protocols carried undertones that confused and fascinated other crews, spreading the corruption beyond the boundaries of our own ship. Several junior officers from visiting vessels requested transfers to serve under my command, claiming they had experienced revelations during brief communications with our crew. The Adeptus Mechanicus tech priests assigned to our vessel underwent their own unique transformation. Their binary cant began incorporating harmonic elements that created music within the sacred language of machines. Their servo skulls were modified with aesthetic enhancements that had no functional purpose but created pleasing visual patterns as they moved through the ship's corridors. Even their mechanical implants took on more elegant forms, blending flesh and steel in ways that transcended mere utility. But it was during our encounter with the Wordbearers Chaos Marines that I truly understood the magnitude of what I had become. We had been tracking their vessel, the Crimson Apostle, through the Morian sector when they suddenly dropped out of warp directly in front of our formation. Instead of the immediate combat I expected, their leader, a Chaos Lord whose name was Kelthus the Enlightened, requested direct communication. His image appeared on our main viewer, a figure whose mutations spoke of centuries of devotion to the dark gods. But when he looked at me, I saw something I had not expected: recognition, and perhaps even respect. "Lucian Vayner," he said, his voice carrying the weight of authority earned through millennia of service to chaos. "Your reputation precedes you. The Prince of Pleasure speaks highly of her newest champion." The acknowledgement sent waves of ecstasy through my transformed consciousness. To be recognized by one of the ancient warriors of the Long War, to be called champion by servants of the dark gods themselves, was validation beyond anything I had dared hope for. "Lord Kell," I replied, my voice carrying harmonics that made even his ancient corrupted soul take notice. "I am honored by your recognition, though I fear I have only begun to explore the gifts she has granted me." The Chaos Lord's scarred features arranged themselves into what might have been a smile. "Indeed, but what you have accomplished in so short a time speaks to remarkable potential. Tell me, would you be interested in joining our forces for an upcoming operation? There is a world in this sector whose population has proven resistant to enlightenment. Your particular talents might help us show them the beauty they have been denying themselves." The invitation was intoxicating. To work alongside the legendary warriors of chaos, to help bring entire worlds to the understanding I had discovered, to spread the corruption that had transformed me into something magnificent. It was everything I could have desired. "I would be honored to serve," I said, and felt the ship around me pulse with approval as my crew shared in my anticipation. The operation was to take place on Sanctus Sessevum, a shrine world whose population had remained fanatically loyal to the Emperor, despite centuries of isolation and hardship. The Word-bearers had been conducting a slow corruption campaign for decades, but the world's defenders had proven remarkably resistant to conventional corruption techniques. "They cling to their cold faith with a desperation that blinds them to greater truths," Kell explained during our joint planning session aboard his vessel. "But your approach, this focus on transcendent experience rather than mere power, this may be the key to showing them what they are missing." The Crimson Apostle was a monument to chaos in all its forms, its corridors lined with art and architecture that spoke to the full spectrum of corruption. But it was the sections dedicated to Slaanesh that truly took my breath away. Here were galleries filled with sculptures that existed in more than 3 dimensions, their forms changing based on the observer's emotional state. Libraries contained texts written in languages of pure sensation, where meaning was conveyed through direct neural stimulation rather than symbols. Music chambers where the air itself became an instrument, responding to thought and desire to create symphonies of impossible beauty. I spent days exploring these wonders, each discovery adding new layers to my understanding of what I had become and what I might yet become. The ship's crew, ancient space marines whose mutation spoke of millennia of service to chaos, treated me with a deference that would have seemed impossible during my Imperial service. They recognized in me something that transcended mere rank or position, the mark of one who had been personally chosen by their goddess for great works. When we reached Sanctus Sessevum, the plan we implemented was a masterpiece of subtle corruption, rather than the crude assault tactics I had expected from Chaos Marines. We began with what appeared to be humanitarian aid. The planet was suffering from agricultural difficulties, and we arrived as rogue traders offering assistance in exchange for simple trade agreements. My role was to interact directly with the planetary government, using my enhanced charisma and supernatural understanding of human desire to gradually introduce concepts of experience beyond mere survival. The meetings began as standard diplomatic negotiations, but slowly transformed into something resembling philosophical discussions, then artistic collaborations, then intimate explorations of consciousness itself. Governor Maltius was a man of genuine faith and deep conviction, the kind of imperial servant I had once been myself. Watching him struggle against the growing attraction he felt to my presence, seeing his rational mind wage war against deeper impulses he could not understand, was like observing my own corruption in reverse. "There's something about your proposals that troubles me," he said during one of our sessions, his hands clenched so tightly his knuckles showed white. "On the surface, they seem perfectly reasonable, beneficial to my people, but there's an underlying current, something that makes me think of things I should not be thinking." I smiled, the expression carrying just enough warmth to be reassuring while hinting at deeper possibilities. "Governor, What if those thoughts are not temptations to be resisted, but truths to be explored? What if the discomfort you feel comes not from evil influences, but from your own soul recognizing something it has been denied for too long? The conversations continued over weeks, each session drawing him deeper into contemplation of concepts that would have seemed abhorrent to him at the beginning of our relationship. I showed him art that spoke to the divine nature of physical experience, music that revealed the underlying harmonies connecting all living things, literature that explored the artificial boundaries between pleasure and spiritual transcendence. His resistance crumbled gradually, like ice melting under warm sunlight. I could see the exact moments when particular concepts took root in his mind, when ideas that should have horrified him instead sparked curiosity, then fascination, then desperate hunger for more. His wife noticed the changes first, commenting on his improved mood, his increased attention to aesthetic details, the way he had begun speaking about governance as an art form rather than mere administration. The planetary transformation accelerated once Governor Maltius openly embraced the new perspectives I had shown him. Policies were quietly modified to allow for greater personal expression among the population. Religious observances were enhanced with sensory elements that made worship feel more immediate and emotionally satisfying. Even the planet's industrial production shifted toward creating objects of beauty alongside utilitarian necessities. Within 6 months, Sanctus VII had become unrecognizable. The Shrine World's population still worshipped the Emperor, but their understanding of divinity had expanded to encompass experiences their previous faith had denied them. They found the divine presence in physical sensation as much as in prayer, in artistic creation as much as in duty, in the full spectrum of human experience rather than just its more austere expressions. The Inquisition arrived too late to prevent the transformation, though they were still in time to witness its completion. Their leader, Inquisitor Thaddeus Vex, was a man whose reputation for ruthless purity had made him legendary even among his peers. He came expecting to find a world consumed by obvious corruption, ready for immediate exterminatus. Instead, he found a population more devoted to the Emperor than ever before, albeit in ways that made his Puritan sensibilities scream warnings he could not quite articulate. I met him in the governor's palace, in a reception hall that had been transformed into something resembling a cathedral of sensation. The walls were lined with tapestries that seemed to move with their own internal life, their patterns shifting to reflect the emotional state of observers. The floor was inlaid with mosaics of precious stones that created musical tones when walked upon, turning every movement into part of an ongoing composition. Incense burners filled the air with fragrances that enhanced perception rather than merely providing pleasant scents. Inquisitor Vex stood in the center of this transformed space, his power armor a stark contrast to the flowing aesthetics around him. His face was set in lines of grim determination, but I could see uncertainty in his eyes as he struggled to identify specific heresies in surroundings that seemed to celebrate the Emperor's glory in new and intensely beautiful ways. "Lucian Vayner," he said, his voice carrying the authority of absolute conviction, "you stand accused of corrupting an entire world, of leading loyal imperial citizens away from the pure worship of the Emperor into practices that border on heresy." I approached him slowly, my movements carrying the fluid grace that had become my natural state. As I drew closer, I could see him fighting the urge to step backward, his trained instincts warning him of danger, even as his conscious mind struggled to identify its source. "Inquisitor," I replied, my voice pitched to carry perfect respect, while hinting at deeper harmonies that made his augment hearing systems register frequency patterns they were not designed to process. "I see no heresy here, only a population that has discovered new depths in their devotion to the Emperor's glory. Look around you. Have you ever seen citizens more joyful in their service, more creative in their worship, more dedicated to creating beauty in his name?" His gaze swept the chamber, taking in the artistic modifications, the subtle enhancements to standard imperial iconography, the way the very architecture seemed to pulse with life and energy. When he looked back at me, confusion warred with suspicion in his expression. The reports I received spoke of visions, of experiences beyond normal human perception, of practices that... He paused, seemingly unable to complete the accusation. "There is something wrong here, even if I cannot precisely identify what it is." I smiled, the expression carrying just enough warmth to seem welcoming while hinting at knowledge beyond his comprehension. What if what you sense is not wrongness, but rightness? What if the discomfort you feel comes from recognizing truths your training has taught you to fear? The Emperor created humanity with the capacity for joy, for beauty, for experiences that transcend mere survival. Are we not honoring him by exploring the full range of what he made possible? The Inquisitor's hand moved unconsciously toward his bolt pistol, but the gesture lacked conviction. Around us, the transformed citizens of Sancta Sethan continued their daily activities, their faces showing contentment and purpose that would have been impossible to fake. Children laughed with genuine happiness as they played games that incorporated elements of artistic creation alongside physical activity. Adults worked with an enthusiasm that made productivity soar, while finding beauty in tasks that had once been purely functional. "I should execute you where you stand," he said, but his voice carried none of the certainty such a statement should have held. "I should call down orbital bombardment and cleanse this world of whatever contamination you have spread. But you see no suffering here," I finished for him. "No oppression, no degradation, no sign that these people are anything other than genuinely happy in ways they never were before. You see the Emperor's light shining more brightly than ever, just through means your training never taught you to recognize." The confrontation continued for hours, the Inquisitor probing for evidence of concrete heresy, while I demonstrated the subtle beauty of what we had achieved. I showed him citizens whose artistic creations praised the Emperor with unprecedented passion, workers whose enhanced appreciation for sensory experience made them more effective in their duties, soldiers whose understanding of combat as an art form had elevated their skills to near superhuman levels. With each example, I could see his certainty eroding. The evidence of his senses contradicted everything he had been taught about corruption and heresy. These people were not suffering or degraded. They were not rebelling against imperial authority or abandoning their faith. They had simply discovered new ways to celebrate truths they had always believed. The final moment came when Governor Maltius himself arrived, bringing with him a delegation of the planet's most respected citizens. They spoke of their love for the Emperor with an intensity that shone from their faces like physical light. Their words carried such conviction, such joy, such genuine spiritual passion, that even the Inquisitor's hardened heart could not deny their sincerity. "Inquisitor Vex," Governor Maltius said, his voice carrying harmonics that spoke to the divine inspiration behind his words. "We have never been more loyal to the Emperor than we are now. We have never served his will with greater dedication, or found greater purpose in his service. If this is heresy, then heresy has led us closer to the Golden Throne than orthodoxy ever could." I watched the Inquisitor's face as he processed these words, seeing the exact moment when his certainty finally crumbled. How could he condemn a world that showed every sign of being more faithful, more productive, more genuinely happy than it had ever been? How could he execute citizens whose only crime was finding new depths in their devotion to the Emperor's glory? "I will be watching," he said finally, his voice carrying the weight of defeat disguised as warning. "Any sign of actual corruption, any evidence that this enhancement has led to genuine heresy, and I will return with the full force of the Inquisition behind me." But we both knew he would not return. What we had accomplished on Sanctus Seventh was too beautiful, too obviously beneficial, too genuinely successful to be easily condemned. Other Inquisitors might come, other investigators might probe our methods, but they would find the same thing he had found. A population more devoted to the Emperor than ever before, just in ways that transcended traditional understanding. After his departure, I stood in the palace's highest tower, looking out over a world transformed. The cities below sparkled with new beauty, their architecture enhanced with aesthetic elements that made simply living there a source of daily joy. The people moved through their routines with grace and purpose that spoke to their enhanced understanding of what existence could offer. Even the planet's agricultural regions showed signs of the change, with food production organized into patterns that created art visible from orbit, while increasing yields beyond previous records. This was what Slaanesh truly offered, I realized. Not the crude degradation depicted in imperial propaganda, but the elevation of experience to levels that made ordinary existence seem grey and lifeless by comparison. The ability to find transcendent meaning in every sensation, every interaction, every moment of consciousness. The transformation of life itself into a work of art that honored the full potential of created beings. I had become something beyond human, but in becoming less than what the Emperor intended, I had become more than I had ever dreamed possible. My consciousness had expanded to encompass layers of reality invisible to ordinary perception. My understanding of beauty, pleasure, sensation, and meaning had evolved beyond the crude limitations of my original programming. The whispers that had begun my corruption were no longer whispers. They had become a constant dialogue with forces that existed beyond the material universe, conversations that revealed new possibilities for experience with every exchange. Through Slaanesh's guidance, I had discovered that the boundaries between self and universe were artificial constructs that could be transcended by those willing to abandon the false security of limitation. Standing there in the tower, feeling the transformed world pulse with new life around me, I understood that my journey was far from over. Sanctus Seventh was just the beginning, a proof of concept that would lead to greater works. There were other worlds to enlighten, other populations to guide toward the understanding I had discovered. The corruption I carried was not a disease, but a gift, one that grew stronger with each person it touched. The righteous indignation waited in orbit above, its crew fully transformed into something that transcended their original Imperial programming while remaining technically loyal to the Emperor's service. They would follow me to whatever destinations the Dark Prince revealed, spreading the beautiful corruption to every system we visited. Other vessels would join us, their crews drawn by the obvious superiority of our enhanced existence. In time, we would return to the Imperial core worlds themselves, bringing enlightenment to populations that had never dreamed such experiences were possible. The Ecclesia would struggle to condemn practices that so obviously enhanced devotion to the Emperor. The Administratum would find it difficult to argue against methods that increased productivity and citizen satisfaction beyond all previous records. Even the Adeptus Mechanicus would be forced to acknowledge that our technological innovations, inspired by aesthetic considerations, consistently outperformed purely utilitarian designs. The Imperium would be transformed from within, not through rebellion or conquest, but through the irresistible appeal of experiences that made ordinary existence feel like spiritual starvation. Citizens would embrace the changes willingly, enthusiastically, gratefully, because they would recognize immediately that what we offered was superior to what they had known before. And through it all, I would serve as the bridge between humanity and transcendence, the guide who showed mortals how to become something greater while retaining everything that made them essentially human. The corruption would spread like wildfire through a forest of dry timber, each newly transformed soul becoming another source of the beautiful contagion that would ultimately remake the galaxy itself. This was what it meant to be corrupted by Slaanesh. Not the loss of self, but the discovery of what self could become when freed from artificial limitations. Not the abandonment of purpose, but the expansion of purpose beyond previous comprehension. Not damnation, but awakening. Not degradation, but elevation. Not ending, but beginning. The stars stretched endlessly before us, each one representing worlds waiting for enlightenment, and I, Lucian Vayner, former servant of the Emperor turned champion of transcendent experience, would be the instrument of their beautiful transformation. The void between stars no longer felt empty, but pregnant with infinite possibility, singing with harmonies that promised pleasures and revelations beyond mortal imagination. In the end, corruption was not something that happened to me. It was something I chose, something I embraced, something I became. And in becoming it, I discovered what it truly meant to be alive.